Warning, this is not entertainment.
You talk like a madman.
But I live like a sailor.
What you don't understand is that it's better to die on your feet than to live on your knees.
You have it backwards. It's better to live on your feet than to die on your knees.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. The air is unfit to breathe. Our food is unfit to eat. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living room. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone.
If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern.
Hello and welcome to Eschaton. Really quick on the front end, and this is very important, so please do not skip ahead. I have an ask of you as the listener in terms of the future of this podcast and how we're going to handle it going forward. As you know, things have been very consistent in terms of recording schedule for Eschaton for the last 12 to 14 months. Some of that's COVID related, some of that's life related. As most of you know, I've moved and kind of doing the farm thing now and, working a job on the side, but that's neither here nor there. The important thing is this, kind of in an impasse as to whether or not we should continue the podcast. And it's not because I don't enjoy doing the podcast. It's because I'm not sure if the audience is still getting value out of it. Podcasting's changed a lot since I started this show in 2017. There's a lot of big corporate media conglomerates in the space, and a lot of podcasts have been bought and are exclusive on platforms now. A lot have been cleaned up and made very professional, which is great. I listen to a lot of shows like that. That's not to knock them at all, but I'm just at an impasse as to whether or not this show is adding value and if there's enough of a listener base anymore to justify keeping it going. So I'm going to ask you to do something here, to take action. And if I don't get response, that'll give me the answer I'm looking for. So really what I'm looking for here is feedback in terms of, one, whether or not you're still listening and enjoy the show. And two, what type of content you're here for. Because we've gone down a lot of different branches over the last few years. And our original charter was much different than, where we've gone. Because I've evolved and my ideas have evolved and I've explored new things like most curious people do. And I want to be true to, the intent of this podcast, but at the same time, I want to give you content that you find valuable. So one, I need to find out if it's worth even continuing the podcast. And two, I need to know what type of content you most enjoy. A few of you have reached out just in the last few months, saying you really enjoyed some of the early stuff like the Isaac Newton prophecy episode. Some of you really like the ancient culture and comparative religion stuff. Some of you like the paranormal stuff. It doesn't matter where the chips fall. I just need to know, what your preference is. And also, again, is there enough of a listener base to justify going forward? So I've got a little challenge here. The goal is to get 25 to 50 new reviews on Apple Podcast. And I say Apple Podcast because, like it or not, it's still the number one podcasting platform of choice, and it's the easiest to track for listener engagement. So right now we've got like 50 reviews on there. If you haven't left one, please leave one. And this is, I promise you, not an exercise in vanity or futility. I'm not looking for people to tell me how great I am. If you hate the show, leave a 1 or a 2-star review. I mean, I'm honestly just looking for engagement. So if you could leave us a review and just genuinely tell me what you like about the show or what you'd like to hear more of, that would really, really help me determine which direction to go if we do keep this thing going. And if you don't use Apple Podcasts, leave a review on your podcasting platform you do use, but I may not see it. So if you do that, I'm going to ask you to take the second step of sending me an email. And you can reach me at josh@joshuawisley.com. Our website, joshUAWISLEY.com. Email address, just josh@joshuawisley.com. Or my personal email address, which I'm kind of hesitant to give out. I've done it a couple times before, though, because people have had issues with the email address linked to the website. So that is jwisley7@gmail.com. Again, my last name's not spelled exactly phonetically. It's JWISLEY7@gmail.com. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you. that's really it on the front end. I'm just sort of at an impasse as to whether or not, it's worthwhile to keep putting the time in to put out the content. If you guys are finding better value elsewhere, that's completely fine. Just let me know, because the show grew really fast early on, and then we kind of just plateaued. I know I alienated some listeners with some of the ideas and rabbit holes we went down, which is fine. I was growing and changing, and I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm still curious about things that, some of you might not like. But I want, as far as content on this show, to be true to what you are here for. So a lot of those things we just won't talk about if we keep going forward, if, you'd rather hear about something else. So let me know, one, if you're still listening and engaged, by leaving a review. I'm looking for 25 to 50 new reviews between now and, this time in November. So that's a month from now. So hopefully by then enough people will have listened to give me the information I need. And if we don't get that, then, I'm content with, calling it a day. We had a good run, and we'll just wrap up the podcast, and I'll put out another episode to, formally close it out. But I would like to keep this thing going if, people want me to. I just want to make sure there's enough critical mass to do that, and also that we're going in a direction that is, going to be desirable. So that's it. Again, I'm asking you to leave a review on Apple Podcasts. If you can't do that, leave a review on your podcasting platform of choice, but also send me an email. And you can always reach me as well through Twitter. You can find me either at Joshua L. Wisely or by Eschaton Podcast on Twitter. I don't have much of a presence there because I'm not really a social media guy, especially Twitter. But you can find us there, as well as the Eschaton Podcast Facebook page, which you can find as well. So those are alternative options. But if you guys could do me this one solid, that would be a huge help. I just really need to know whether or not, this is providing value, and whether or not we should keep it going, or if we should amicably agree to end the pod. But that's all. So if you could do that, I would greatly appreciate it. And, whichever way it goes, it's been a pleasure hosting this podcast for the last several years. I've been in a season of life where I've been just listening more, reading more, trying to be more still. I think being in the wilderness and out in the countryside has kind of slowed my mind down a little bit. So that's part of the reason why I haven't been so eager to put out new podcast material. But again, with everybody and their brother podcasting today, I don't want to just be another podcast. So if it's always to some extent going to be that. But if it's not adding value, let me know. And no harm, no foul. But thank you regardless, and it's been a pleasure. And with that, let's jump into the episode. When I was a kid, I was fascinated by Greek mythology. Many of the deities we have talked about in this podcast, from Moloch in the last episode to, Thor and Odin and some of the Scandinavian Norse mythology in earlier episodes, a lot of them have their root in a earlier version of that deity. And you can argue over who the earliest version is, the earliest incarnation, but whether we're going back to Marduk, who is the highest deity for the ancient Babylonians, or even earlier, to some of these primordial forms like Tiamat, or the earliest incarnations of Saturn and Uranus, which debatable on what the earliest incarnations are. They go by different names. It's hard to argue that the Greek myth, the Greek pantheon, isn't anchored to that same core pantheon that we see in Persian mythology and Middle Eastern lore. But the god I want to talk about today, I'm talking about him with the Greek name because most people will know him by that title. And additionally, when we tie it into the relevance today, I think it most clearly associates through the Greek interpretation. And that god is Dionysus. Olympia, the mother of Alexander the Great, was said to be a follower of the cult of Dionysus. She worshipped him above all others. She was also a snake charmer and a snake handler, if that tells you anything about Dionysus. But what he was known for was being the god of having a good time, if I'm being honest. And a lot of people like Dionysus because of that. He was the god of wine, of revelry, of sexual lust. And over time, he grew into a colossus. It's said that Dionysus could be as old as 6,000 years old, which would make him one of the earliest known deities in any pantheon. Granted, he wouldn't have gone by the name Dionysus probably in those earliest incarnations, but he would have been worshipped by the Persians and their predecessors in Mesopotamia. Some say that he would have first been worshipped as a god in the Zagros Mountains, which is sort of the borderland mountain range between Iran and Iraq today. So right in that cradle where the Akkadians, the Sumerians, the Babylonians all came to fruition. If Dionysus was there in the earliest days, was he a man who died and became deified, like so many of these demigods that we read about? Or was he truly a supernatural being, like some of these watchers and fallen angels that we read about? I have an opinion on a lot of those entities and what their origin story might be, but Dionysus is a little harder to pin down. I'm not so sure because he seems to play into human passion in every way. Dionysus represents the base desires of man. And even his worshippers knew that to give yourself over to Dionysus on a full-time basis was a recipe for disaster. That's why he's known for having some of the most outrageous and enjoyable and anticipatory festivals in the ancient world. The festivals of Dionysus were things of note. They were so raucous that even Herodotus, the great historian, would not name Dionysus by name. And when he talked of the festivals, he would say the festivals of that god, of the god. Like, people knew who he was talking about, but he almost had to blush. That was sort of the interpretation you had to go for with Herodotus, because he did not even want to call out Dionysus by name, because he knew what type of debauchery happened at a Dionysus-inspired gathering. But his festivals, nonetheless, were very religious events. It was a time for letting go of the logic, the order, the reason, the balance, and civilized self for a time, to live in accordance with our uttermost desires, our passions. I think it was Tolstoy who said, to suggest that man can be ruled by reason alone is to deny the possibility of life entirely. And that's a paraphrase. Christopher McCandless quotes that as well, much later on in the 1900s when he's going on his journey out west. And I think there's some truth in that. To constantly be ruled by reason and base logic sounds like the mature thing to do, but it also quenches that other thing in us, the other side of us. Some have called it the shadow, like Carl Jung. Others compare the two as the anima and the animus, that light and the dark, the yin and the yang is another interpretation. The male and the female energies, call it what you will. There's been many interpretations over time. But Dionysus represents that dark energy, no doubt. And there's a place for it, all things in balance. His alternative is the god of light, Apollo. Apollo is that god of reason, of logic, order. He was the protector of Hector and the Trojans. And Hector and Achilles are kind of a representation, if you're being reflective of this, in bodily form. Hector, in all ways, was a representation of Apollo, right? He was true to his duty. He was rational, logical, stern, strong, positive, light, a good father. Achilles was the antithesis to that. He operated purely on passion. When his lover Patroclus was killed at the hands of Hector, Achilles went into a blind rage and murdered many, many civilians who had nothing to do, as well as, Hector and many of the Trojan warriors. Achilles is the name that we remember today as the great hero, but he was purely ruled by his passion. There was a time in my life where I would have agreed with the Apollonians, who said that rule and logic and reason should be our only guide. In fact, Thomas Jefferson said that reason should be our only oracle. And I'm a big Jeffersonian, as you know, if you've been listening to this show for any time. But I think he was wrong in that regard. I don't think it should be our only oracle. I think most of our life should be guided by reason, but all things in moderation, including moderation. There has to be a time for the shadow to reign supreme. Otherwise, man will destroy himself. He'll never truly understand who he is and come to have a realization of that part of himself that needs to be tamed. This is what the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche preached when he came around much later in the 19th century. Nietzsche, one of the giants of modern philosophy, has been championed by everyone from nihilists to atheists to even some branches of Christian and religious sects. But Nietzsche himself looked into this dichotomy between Apollo and Dionysus, and he too saw that they stood above all others in the Greek pantheon, even above Lord Zeus himself, in terms of their relatability to the human condition. And I think Nietzsche correctly realized and pointed out that we were moving into a time of Dionysian revelry. And he lived in a time, I think, at the tail end of the last Apollonian age. So this would be the time of the Enlightenment, the time of the Renaissance, revolutions around the world based on values tied to human rights and the idea of human rights themselves being based in reason and logic and the idea of a just and good God. I mean, this was the age of intellect and heroes of the mind. People like Rousseau, John Locke, Immanuel Kant, Thomas Jefferson, who I mentioned, Francis Bacon. I mean, over several centuries, the Apollonian model reigned supreme, especially in the Western world, and so much progress and development came from it. But something happened at the turn of the 20th century, and it really picked up steam with World War I, and I think World War I is really what kicked off the transformation, so to speak, from the Apollonian age to the age we find ourselves in now. Many have said that World War I and World War II are really the same event. They're just separated by an intermission where Germany really was put in time out and needed time to regroup. But that intermission of 15, 20 years was not a time of peace. It was a time for ideas to form, take shape, and for the new world to be mapped out in its full blueprint. And it would come into fruition. That machine of industry and warfare would break the bones of many of these Apollonians. And on the other side of that war, the world would be a very different place. And by the time of the 1940s, the 1950s, that old guard, the last of that dying breed of Apollonians, those great thinkers, those people that saw a world that could be ruled with order and rationality, many of them were gone because the war claimed so many lives, and it was so absurd, so preposterous, so many young men dying uselessly in trenches and pits and open fields, entire landscapes destroyed, from Normandy to the Somme, that so many people wondered how could rationality and order be supreme if it led us to this place. And because of that, this Dionysian revelry, freedom, this rule by the passions sort of crept in. I would argue that it was sort of already springing into the minds of people who wanted to change, because any man, if he becomes too comfortable, will create disorder in his own life just for a bit of excitement, going back to my point of balance. And I think that's what happened. That's why the world set off like a tinderbox with World War I, 1914 to 1917, and then again with World War II. And on the other side of that, the Apollonian way had almost been quenched out. And by the late 50s to early 60s, I think it was pretty much gone. The zeitgeist, the Cultural Revolution had taken hold. Many of you will go right to the hippie movement and say, yeah, free love, hippies, that makes sense, Dionysian. But even before that, in the 1950s, there was a movement called the beatnik movement, which I'm really interested in. I actually think it's more fascinating than the hippie movement. It was more short-lived and not as extreme, but they were looking for the same thing that a lot of the movements that came after were looking for, but in a more wholesome way. Not to suggest that it was wholesome by any means, but I mean, if you read the works of like Jack Kerouac, On the Road, or Allen Ginsberg, I mean, a lot of that stuff, it sowed the seeds for what would come in the 60s and the 70s with the hippie movement. And in fact, most have, I think, correctly concluded that the hippies were the bastard children of the beatniks. But the beatniks were trying to do something noble. They were almost trying to create a Dionysian structure that was still contained for the most part. They believed that for a season, you would have that freedom and revelry to explore, but then you would come back to your senses. You would come back to the Apollonian way. With the hippie movement, that all went out the window. Free love, drugs, the sexual revolution. I mean, it was a permanent way of life, and people literally lost their minds because of it. I mean, the movement fueled by Leary and others, that was tied to LSD and some of the other psychedelics that were just popping up onto the scene then, but it went beyond drugs. The free love, the living in communes, all of that, I think, was rooted in a very pure idea. But what they tried to do was they tried to take the Dionysian core and make it a permanent way of life. And by doing that, they destroyed the foundation and the fabric of all of their society, because everyone who has come before has known that Dionysus needs to be contained. He cannot run free, or he will destroy your life. Apollo has his place 90% of the time, but that other 10% is the day of Dionysus. We flipped that, and we tried to bury Apollo, and we condemned anybody who tried to resurrect him. And it led to an awakening, a revolution of sorts, a secular revolution over the last 50, 60 years. There's actually a quote, if I could find it, I'll insert it right here, of Jack Kerouac reflecting on the beatnik movement and the hippie movement that had taken its place. And by this point, he was an older man. I mean, he died in his 40s, so he wasn't old by any means. But he was reflecting on, his journey. In fact, he actually refers to them as, sort of a Dionysian cult. He thought that they just took the ideals and everything that was good about the awakening of that Dionysian moment of the 50s and just destroying it.
Now, Jack, Mr. Kerouac, what I want to ask is this. To what extent do you believe that the beat generation is related to the hippies?
Oh,
what do they have in common? Was this an evolution from the one to the other?
They're just the older ones.
Yeah.
So I'm 46 years old. These kids are 18. It's the same movement, which is apparently some kind of Dionysian movement in late civilization, and which I did not intend any more than I suppose Dionysius did, or whatever his name was. But although I'm not Dionysius the Areopagite, I should have been.
Yeah, that's the point, yeah.
No, it's just a movement which is supposed to be licentious, but it isn't really.
Well, now, licentious in what respect?
The hippies are good kids. They're better than the beat. The beats, see, Ginsberg and I, Ginsberg, boy. We're 40. We're all in our 40s, and we started this, and the kids took it up and everything. But a lot of hoodlums, and communists jumped on our backs. Well, on my back, not his. Ferlinghetti jumped on my back and turned the idea that I had that the beat generation was a generation of beatitude and pleasure in life and tenderness. But they called it in the papers beat mutiny, beat insurrection. Words I never used. Being a Catholic, I believe in order, tenderness, and piety.
Well, then your point was that a meeting, that a movement which you conceived as relatively pure has become ideologized and misanthropic and generally
A movement that was
objectionable.
No, a movement that was considered what?
Pure.
Yes, it was pure in my heart.
So why do I talk about Dionysus? Why are we bringing him up today? Because in this little mini-series that we're on, talking about ancient gods and their place in the modern world, I can't think of one more potent as a representation of the world we live in today than Dionysus. We live in a society that has become decadent in every way. We're led by our passions, our emotions, and our base human impulses. And it's become a brand. Capitalism has even noticed this and pivoted as such. I mean, you could argue that they're responsible in a lot of ways, but the marketing and the advertising industry, the madmen of the world, so to speak, I mean, they know that humans are driven and manipulated now more than ever by their emotions. So every billboard, every magazine ad, every ad you get when you watch a YouTube video, or everything you see in a commercial, it's all designed to appeal to your basest desires. That is not a coincidence. And it doesn't work in an Apollonian world, but it damn well works in a Dionysian one. In ancient Greece, the Dionysian cult promised eternal life. And they believed that it could be achieved through revelry, through an ecstatic state of pure experience and lustful rage. And, that's not a unique idea in the ancient world. That actually has, come up to the modern day with Aleister Crowley and sex magic and other interpretations as such. I think they're all rooted in that same seed. You could even find it in traces in Genesis, where the sexual imagery when it talks about Tiamat over the waters of the deep. It's loaded with sexual imagery about chaos and order, and how order needs to subdue chaos. Well, Dionysus is the opposite of that. It's chaos subduing the order, and through that, achieving eternal life. The Dionysian cult was banned by the Romans, if you could imagine that. But there was a time, where even the Romans, in the earliest days, the Republic was very Apollonian. It was guided by reason and order. And then later, in the time of the Empire, some of those moral values started to change. You could argue there were any number of reasons for that, but empires, as they grow wealthy and rich and comfortable, tend to become more decadent. And that's the way Rome went, as many others since. But even the Romans, for a time, banned these Dionysian festivals because they thought that it fed too much into the undesirable part of the human condition. We now find ourselves living in a day and age where Apollo has more or less been put to death. The idea of rationality and order has been completely drowned out and silenced by pure impulse and desire. Every day is a Dionysian cult worship, and we must be aware of this to understand how we correct this path. I tend to think more and more that the event that brought us into this age is going to be the same event that brings us out of it. And I'm talking about a great war. World War I and World War II ushered in the current Dionysian age, and I think the next great war will somewhat snap the remaining people among us back to their senses and bring back a more stable, orderly, conservative, reserved version of the human experience. And that might even sound so foreign and so far away right now that it's hard to even envision, because it seems like, the myth of progress is that it goes in a straight line, and therefore, we're so liberal and progressive now, so self-serving and selfish in every way, that how could we imagine a time in the future where people will revert to conservatism? I really do think that, history shows that things go in waves, and if we learn anything from history, it's that we don't learn from history, but even so, it will repeat itself. People now will look to their descendants in the future as being more conservative than them, because they will look back at the consequences that their parents and grandparents created, and they will try to avoid it. And by doing that, they may overcorrect in the opposite direction. But I believe very much so that there will be a golden age on the other side of this coming cataclysm. And I know I'm not alone. I mean, I see it all over the Twitter sphere. I see it on, social media of all sorts. People feel it in their bones that we are building towards something, that something of epic scale is coming toward us, but nobody can quite put a finger on what it is. Some think it's going to be nuclear war. Some think it's just going to be a global catastrophe that wipes most of the human population out. Others think there's going to be contact by extraterrestrials. I don't know what it's going to be, but there's that current feeling that almost every single one of us has realized that this is it. This is the end. Not the end of the world, so to speak. Maybe it is. But at least the end of an age, which is basically the same thing if you ask me. And I think when our age ends, and I'm still looking, to the next 10 to 20 years for that to transpire, I think that on the other side of it, we will enter a golden age if, God willing, we're still here. And if, the Lord tarries and the world doesn't end, I really do think the next golden age is going to be an Apollonian one, as most golden ages are. But right now is the pinnacle of the Age of Dionysus. And you need to realize that when you look at your friends, your family around you, the world that you're living and operating in, it's a very, very difficult one to be a conservative, responsible human being. And I say conservative in the lowercase of the word, not in any political connotation, but to be reserved in your judgments and your thoughts, to not operate on impulse, to be irrational, to respond off the cuff. That's what I mean when I say conservative. To be more level-headed. It's not popular right now. Everybody has a voice. Everybody has a platform. Everybody has an opinion, and they share it. We are in the chaos. Dionysus is alive and well. He's laughing because he is controlling this world. He is the prince of the power of the air. And as the internet spreads its web and tentacles more and more around the world, Dionysus grows stronger and stronger. And maybe our age will end with a cataclysm that sends us back to sticks and stones. And if that's the case, all the more reason that it will be an Apollonian one to follow. But I think, more likely than not, our technology and our tools will remain, but people will willingly put constraints around them when they see the consequences and the fallout of what's to come. Only time will tell, but the next great age, I think, is just around the corner. The problem is that standing between us and that next great age is likely a cataclysm that the world has never seen, at least on a scale that the world has never seen. We may use different names today. We may even call it nihilism, atheism, agnosticism. Whatever you want to call it is fine, but at its core, it's really just Dionysianism. I have yet to see anybody who uses those aforementioned labels who is not living according to the principles of Dionysus, ruled by their passions. Even the most orderly and rational, philosophical-minded among us, still, we're all Dionysian at our core. And Dionysus plays us. like a puppet master with their marionette. So what I want you to conclude and walk away with today is just that awareness that this is not a godless age. This is not an age where God is dead, like Nietzsche concluded, but quite the opposite. This is an age where new gods are just the old gods in disguise. And they trick us by acting like they're not gods at all, that it's really just us. But all it is us given over to the god that rules our passions, and that is Dionysus. Dionysus may be sneakily the most powerful god in history. And in moderation, he may seem innocent enough, a time of revelry and freedom, of loosening and letting down the hair. But when it moves beyond moderation, it is perhaps the most destructive force in the world. It becomes Tiamat, the great serpent. And what I believe is that there's going to have to be an El-like response, an Elohim that comes down and stabilizes the great dragon of chaos, which is Dionysus, in my opinion. That will come at the back of Cataclysm. Not in your children's lifetime or your grandchildren's lifetime, but very much in our own. I'm betting the farm on that, so to speak. And that's part of the reason why I live on a farm now. So tongue in cheek, but only half kidding. There's going to come a day in the not too distant future where we're either going to die with Dionysus or we're going to reawaken the god of light. And it's going to be for us to make that decision. But if we choose to stay the course, well, history tells us how that path ends. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening to this primer on Dionysus, more or less the age of Dionysus. The reason why we chose this topic for this podcast is because I think it's most timely in terms of where we are in the grand scheme of things. There have been many ages of Dionysus before, but I don't think any have had the tools and the technology to accompany them that we have today. And because of that, this may be the most destructive Dionysian age that the world has yet faced. And every Apollonian age that has preceded it has likewise not been as potent as the one that could follow. So I want to leave this on a positive note, because just like this Dionysian age has been one of every desire, every human impulse being satisfied on demand to the point where it satiated us and made us weak and feeble, I think that the Apollonian age to follow could be just as powerful. We start using our technology for good rather than evil. We start being less self-serving and look to the stars, look to the sea, look to ways to improve humanity. We're seeing seeds of it now in Generation Z and, some of the kids that are growing up with millennial and boomer parents and Gen X parents. They're seeing the mistakes we've made and they're trying to correct them. Granted, I think the social justice warrior path is going to end badly because most of that even is Dionysian, but I do think there is a pure kernel of goodness and truth rooted at this, and that is going to birth the next Apollonian age. So keep your head up on the other side of what is to come. There is going to be a golden age, an Apollonian age like the world, I believe, has never seen. Maybe that'll be the 1,000-year kingdom that the Bible talks about. I don't know, but I do look to it, and I believe it's coming. But if you want to make it to the kingdom, you first got to go through the darkness, and the darkness is here, and it's only going to get darker in the short term, I fear. So watch and be prepared, and don't let that day catch you unexpectedly. And once more, please don't forget the request at the beginning of the episode. It's very important. If we want to keep Eschaton going, I need to hear from you, so I look forward to getting some responses on that. Thank you all. Take care.